I moved into Willow Creek Estates on a muggy August afternoon, the kind where the air feels like a damp towel slapped across your face. The cul-de-sac shimmered under a heat haze, all pristine lawns and cookie-cutter McMansions with brick facades that screamed suburban ambition. I'd snagged the place for a steal: 3 bedrooms, 2 baths, and a garage bigger than my old apartment, after my divorce left me scrambling for a fresh start. The realtor, a wiry guy named Ted with a handshake like a limp fish, kept muttering about motivated sellers and a quiet community. I didn't ask questions. I should have. The first sign something was off came when I met Linda Voss, the HOA president. She rolled up in a golf cart, lime green with a bumper sticker that read Willow Creek, where neighbors thrive, before I'd even unpacked my U-Haul. Linda was mid-50s, hair dyed a brassy blonde that clashed with her olive sundress, and she had this smile that didn't reach her eyes. They were sharp, like she was sizing me up for a cut of meat. "Welcome to the neighborhood, Daniel," she said, handing me a binder thicker than a college textbook. "We've got rules here, keeps things civilized." I flipped through it later over a beer, sprawled on my new couch that still smelled like plastic wrap. No loud music after 9 p.m. Lawns mowed weekly, blades no higher than 3 inches. Trash cans out of sight except pickup day. It was obsessive, sure, but I'd lived in worse places. Apartments with roaches the size of my thumb and neighbors who screamed through paper-thin walls. I figured I could handle a few busybodies with clipboards. That was my first mistake. The second came 3 days later when I got a knock at 7 a.m. I stumbled to the door in boxers and a faded Metallica tee, bleary-eyed from a night of doom-scrolling job listings. Standing there was a guy who looked like he'd stepped out of a golf magazine: khaki shorts, polo shirt, and a tan so even it had to be sprayed on. "Greg Hensley," he said, thrusting out a hand. "Block captain. Saw your grass was at 3.2 inches yesterday. Thought I'd give you a heads up before Linda writes you up." I blinked, still half asleep. It's been 3 days. I haven't even bought a mower yet. Greg chuckled, but it was the kind of laugh that made my skin crawl, like he knew something I didn't. "Better hop to it, buddy. Rules are rules. Oh, and heads up. Meeting tonight, 7 p.m. Clubhouse. Mandatory for newbies." He clapped me on the shoulder and sauntered off, whistling some jaunty tune I couldn't place. I stood there, dazed, watching him disappear around the corner where the hydrangeas bloomed in perfect, unnatural symmetry. The clubhouse was a squat building at the neighborhood's edge, sandwiched between a man-made pond and a tennis court nobody seemed to use. Inside, it smelled like lemon polish and stale coffee. About 20 people sat in folding chairs, all prim and pressed like they were auditioning for a Norman Rockwell painting. Linda stood at a podium, gavel in hand, her voice clipped as she rattled off fines. $50 for Mrs. Carter's unpainted mailbox, $75 for the Johnsons' unapproved patio lights. I slouched in the back, nursing a styrofoam cup of burnt coffee, wondering how I'd ended up in a place where people cared this much about mailboxes. Then came the new business. Linda's eyes locked on me and the room went quiet. "Daniel Pierce, Lot 17. Glad you could join us. We've got your orientation packet ready. Greg'll walk you through it after." She slid a manila envelope across the table, her nails painted a garish coral tapping rhythmically. The packet was heavy, stuffed with forms, maps, and a laminated card with my name and a barcode. "What's this?" I asked, holding it up. "Your covenant ID," Greg piped up from the front row. "Tracks compliance, keeps us all accountable." The way he said accountable sent a shiver down my spine, but I brushed it off. I was tired, paranoid. Divorce does that to you. That night I couldn't sleep. The house was too quiet, the kind of silence that presses against your eardrums. Around 2 a.m. I heard it, a low hum like a generator kicking on. I shuffled to the window, peering through the blinds. Across the street, Linda's golf cart idled in the moonlight, its headlights off. She wasn't alone. Two figures stood beside it, heads bent in conversation. One was Greg, the other was too shadowed to make out. They gestured toward my house, then dispersed into the dark. My gut twisted. What the hell was worth whispering about at 2 a.m.? The next morning I found a note slipped under my door. Plain white paper typed in blocky font. Mow by noon or pay the price. No signature, but the message was clear. I grabbed my keys, drove to Home Depot and bought the cheapest mower they had. By 11:55 I was sweating through my shirt, grass clippings sticking to my legs, the lawn a jagged 2.8 inches. Good enough, I thought. I was wrong. At dusk, Greg showed up again, this time with a tape measure. He crouched by my front yard, lips pursed, then stood with a smirk. 2.8's close, but close isn't 3. Linda's writing you up. $25 fine, first offense. Don't worry, it's just the start. He handed me a yellow slip, the barcode from my ID stamped in the corner. I stared at it, my pulse ticking up. The start of what? I asked. Greg's smirk widened. You'll see. Orientation's tomorrow. Don't miss it. He turned away, leaving me on my porch with a sinking feeling I couldn't shake. The air smelled faintly of gasoline and something sharper, like metal or blood. I glanced at the slip again. In tiny print at the bottom, almost invisible, was a single line. Ask about the pond. What pond? And why did I feel like I'd just signed up for something I couldn't escape? The orientation was scheduled for 6 p.m. in the clubhouse basement. A detail Greg had slipped into our last chat with that smug, knowing grin of his. I spent the day rattled, the yellow fine slip burning a hole in my pocket. That line, ask about the pond, kept circling my brain like a vulture over roadkill. The man-made pond by the clubhouse wasn't much to look at. A murky oval fringed with cattails, its surface slick with algae that glowed faintly green in the sun. I'd assumed it was just a drainage ditch dressed up for curb appeal. Now, I wasn't so sure. By 5:45, I was packing my foyer, the Covenant ID card in one hand, a lukewarm Bud Light in the other. I didn't want to go, but the fine and Greg. Just the start jab had me spooked. What was the penalty for skipping? Another $25, a public shamming at the next meeting. I pulled on a flannel over my tee, grabbed my keys, and trudged out into the evening. The air was thick with cicada buzz, the sky bruising purple as dusk settled over Willow Creek. Every house I passed had its blinds drawn tight, like the neighborhood was holding its breath. The clubhouse basement door was unmarked, a slab of steel tucked behind a row of boxwoods. I hesitated, then knocked. It creaked open, revealing Linda in a floral blazer that looked like it had been ironed to death. "Right on time, Daniel," she said, her voice syrupy but edged with something hard. She waved me in, and I descended a concrete stairwell that smelled of mildew and old paper. The basement was bigger than I'd expected, low-ceilinged, lit by buzzing fluorescents, with folding tables arranged in a U-shape. About a dozen people sat there, faces I vaguely recognized from the meeting. Mrs. Carter with her unpainted mailbox, a guy with a buzz cut who'd nodded at me once over his recycling bins. They all stared as I took a seat. Greg stood at the front, a projector humming beside him. "Welcome to orientation," he said, clicking a remote. The screen flickered to life with a slide. "Willow Creek Estates, a legacy of order." He launched into a spiel about the HOA's founding in '92, how it preserved property values and fostered unity. I tuned out, my eyes drifting to the others. Mrs. Carter's hands trembled as she clutched a pen. Buzz Cut kept glancing at the door. The vibe was off, less like a pep rally, more like a cult induction. Then the slide changed. A grainy photo of the pond pre-construction, just a muddy pit surrounded by woods. "Our cornerstone," Greg called it, his tone reverent. "Every rule, every fine ties back to this." I leaned forward, squinting. Something was off about the image, dark shapes in the water, too symmetrical to be rocks. Before I could process it, Linda cut in. "Questions later. Let's move to the pledge. Pledge, my stomach dropped as Greg passed out laminated cards, each with a barcode and a block of text. Read it aloud, Linda instructed, her coral nails drumming the table. The group complied, voices monotone. I swear to uphold the covenant of Willow Creek, to honor its boundaries and to protect its heart. I mumbled along, half a beat behind, my mind snagging on its heart. The pond, the rules, what were we protecting? After Linda handed out folders, mine was labeled Lot 17 Compliance Plan. Inside were schedules, lawn care, trash rotation, a map with my house circled in red, and a list of infraction tiers. Tier 1 was fines. Tier 2 was community service. Tier 3 just said review, no explanation. I flipped to the map again. A dotted line ran from my backyard to the pond, labeled access route. Why the hell would I need that? Any questions? Greg asked, scanning the room. I raised my hand, heart thudding. What's with the pond? The words hung there heavy. Linda's smile tightened, Greg's eyes flicked to her. It's symbolic, he said, too fast. Represents our commitment. You'll learn more at Tier 2. Mrs. Carter coughed, a wet, nervous sound. Buzz Cut stared at his hands. Nobody else spoke. Dismissed at 8 p.m., I bolted upstairs, the folder under my arm like a live wire. Outside, the pond loomed in the dark, its surface rippling under a half-moon. I swore I saw something break the water, a hand maybe, or a trick of the light. I shook it off and hurried home, locking the door behind me. Sleep didn't come easy. At 3 a.m. I heard that hum again, louder, vibrating through the floorboards. I peeked out back. The dotted line on the map. It glowed faintly, a trail of tiny lights snaking toward the pond. What the actual hell? Next morning, I found a new note under my door. Tier 1 violation, unapproved exterior light detected. $50, pay by Friday. I hadn't installed any lights. Confused, I stepped outside. A solar lantern, cheap plastic, not mine, sat by my mailbox, glowing weakly. Someone had planted it there. Linda's golf cart rolled by as I stared, her wave too cheerful for 7 a.m. Keep up, Daniel, she called. We're watching. I paid the fine online. The HOA cite a clunky relic with a resident portal that demanded my barcode. It logged my payment, then flashed a message. Tier 1 progress, 2-5. 2 out of 5 what? Violations. Warnings. I clicked around, finding a locked tab labeled Pond Records. Password protected. Great. That afternoon, I cornered Mrs. Carter watering her azaleas. She flinched when I said hi, her gray curls bobbing. The pond, I whispered. What's the deal? Her eyes darted to Linda's house, then back. Don't ask yet, she hissed. Not till Tier 2, and fix that mailbox. I can't take another fine. She scurried inside, leaving me with more questions than answers. By nightfall, I was obsessed. I grabbed a flashlight and followed the glowing trail from my yard. It led to the pond's edge, where the water lapped at a concrete slab half submerged. Carved into it was a single word, bound. A splash echoed, too big for a fish. I swung the beam across the surface. Nothing. But the air felt wrong, heavy with that metallic tang I'd smelled before. I backed away, pulse racing, knowing I'd crossed a line I couldn't uncross. I woke up the next morning with a headache that felt like someone had taken a sledgehammer to my skull. The flashlight sat on my nightstand, its beam still flickering from last night's pond expedition. Bound. That word carved into the slab haunted me, looping through my thoughts as I brewed coffee strong enough to strip paint. The kitchen window framed a perfect view of the cul-de-sac. Manicured lawns, identical mailboxes, Linda's golf cart parked 2 houses down. Too perfect. Too still. I checked the backyard. The glowing trail was gone, like it never existed. Had I imagined it? No, the metallic tang still lingered in my nostrils, sharp and real. By noon, I was jittery, packing the living room with my compliance plan folder splayed across the coffee table. The map's dotted line mocked me, a silent dare. I needed answers, but Mrs. Carter's warning. Not till Tier 2 kept me from storming Linda's doorstep. Instead, I logged into the resident portal again. Tier 1 progress 2.5 stared back unchanged. I clicked the pond records tab out of spite. Same password prompt. On a whim, I typed bound. Access denied. Covenant. Denied. Willow Creek. Denied. Frustrated, I slammed the laptop shut just as the doorbell rang. It was Buzz cut from orientation. Turns out his name was Rick. He stood there in a plaid shirt holding a toolbox, his jaw tight. HOA sent me, he said, voice flat. Your garage door's off alignment, Tier 1 violation. I fix it or you get fined $75. I hadn't noticed anything wrong, but sure enough, the door tilted half an inch left when I checked. Rick worked fast, grunting as he adjusted the tracks, sweat beading on his buzzed scalp. How long you been here? I asked, leaning against the wall. 2 years, he muttered, not looking up. Long enough. Long enough for what? He paused, wrench in hand, then glanced at me, eyes dark hollow. To know you don't ask about the pond till they let you. He went back to work, lips sealed. I pressed anyway. What's Tier 2 like? Rick's shoulders stiffened, but he didn't answer. When he finished, he handed me a slip. Violation cleared, $20 service fee. Another barcode stamp. I was at 3.5 now. That night the hum returned, louder, rattling my windows. I grabbed the flashlight and crept outside, drawn to the pond like a moth to a flame. The air was cooler, thick with damp earth and that metallic edge. At the slab I traced bound with my fingers, cold, rough concrete. The water lapped higher tonight, kissing the edges. Something glinted beneath the surface. A chain, maybe, coiled in the muck. Before I could lean closer, headlights flared, Linda's golf cart barreling down the path. I ducked behind a willow, heart pounding. She stopped at the pond alone and tossed something small into the water. A splash, then silence. She lingered, staring at the ripples, then drove off. I waited 10 minutes before bolting home, my sneakers soaked. The next day, a new note arrived. Tier 1 violation, unauthorized nighttime activity. $100, pay by noon tomorrow. Unauthorized activity. They'd seen me, how cameras, neighbors. I paid it online, pushing my progress to 4.5. The portal updated, Tier 2 eligibility pending review. Review. That word from the infraction tiers. My stomach churned. At dusk, Greg knocked, his tan somehow darker, his polo crisp as ever. Good news, buddy, he said, clapping my shoulder. You're fast-tracking to Tier 2. Reviews tomorrow, 8 p.m. Clubhouse. Dress nice. He didn't wait for a reply, just sauntered off, whistling again. I stood there, the fine slips piling up in my mind like unpaid bills. Fast-tracking. I hadn't asked for this. I spent the day digging. First, I called Ted the realtor, leaving a voicemail. Why'd the last owners bail so fast? No callback. Then I Googled Willow Creek Estates history. Nothing juicy, just bland real estate listings and a defunct community blog from 2010, all potluck recaps and yard of the month posts. The pond got one mention. Dedication ceremony 1993. A gift to bind us. There was a photo, grainy like the orientation slide, with blurry figures standing knee-deep in water. I zoomed in. One held what looked like a shovel or a chain. At 7:45 p.m., I pulled on a button-down, my only clean one, and headed to the clubhouse. The basement was packed this time, 30 people, maybe more, all in slacks and blouses like it was church. Linda presided at a long table, flanked by Greg and a woman I didn't recognize. Thin, gray-haired, with a necklace of wooden beads. "Review board," Greg whispered as I sat. The room buzzed with tension, everyone avoiding eye contact. Linda called my name first. Daniel Pierce, Lot 17. 4 Tier 1 violations in 6 days. Impressive. A few nervous laughs. I shifted, palms sweaty. Progress indicates commitment, she continued. We're advancing you to Tier 2. Any objections? The board stared. I shook my head, too rattled to argue. Linda slid me a new folder, Tier 2 duties. Inside, a single page, monitor Lot 14. Report deviations by Friday. Access pond as needed. Lot 14 was Mrs. Carter's place. Questions? Linda asked. I swallowed. Why the pond? Her smile faltered, then snapped back. It's where we settle things, she said cryptically. You'll see. The gray-haired woman leaned forward, beads clacking. It's a privilege, Daniel, don't waste it. Dismissed, I stumbled upstairs, folder in hand, the hum starting up again as I hit fresh air. Back home, I watched Lot 14 from my window. Mrs. Carter's lights were off, her mailbox still unpainted. At midnight, I saw her silhouette in her yard, hunched, digging something small into the soil. A splash from the pond echoed across the night. I grabbed my flashlight, hesitating. Monitor and report. Was this a test, a trap? The chain I'd glimpsed, did she know about it? I didn't sleep, the hum a constant pulse, the word bound searing my brain. Whatever I'd signed up for, it was too late to back out. The next morning hit me like a freight train, exhaustion so deep my bones ached. I'd stayed up past 3 a.m., peering at Mrs. Carter's house through my blinds, her silhouette burned into my retinas. That hunched figure digging, the faint splash from the pond, it gnawed at me. My Tier 2 duties folder sat on the kitchen counter, its single page glaring. Monitor Lot 14. Report deviations by Friday. Today was Wednesday. 2 days to figure out what deviations meant, and why the pond kept pulling me in like a siren's call. I brewed coffee, black and bitter, and stood at the window. Mrs. Carter's place was quiet, curtains drawn, that unpainted mailbox taunting me from her curb. The neighborhood hummed with its usual rhythm, sprinklers hissing, a distant lawnmower growling. But it felt staged, like a set dressing hiding something rotten. I grabbed my phone and snapped a photo of Lot 14, figuring I'd need proof if I reported anything. The air outside carried that metallic tang again, stronger now, mingling with cut grass and gasoline. By noon, I couldn't take it anymore. I marched over to Mrs. Carter's, my sneakers crunching on the pristine sidewalk. Her doorbell chimed, a cheery ding-dong that felt out of place. No answer. I knocked harder, nothing. Peering through her front window, I saw only shadows, a floral couch, a TV flickering static. Then movement, a flash of gray curls in the hallway. Mrs. Carter, I called. The curtains twitched and her face appeared, pale and pinched. Go away, Daniel, she hissed through the glass. You're making it worse. Making what worse? I pressed. What were you burying last night? Her eyes widened, then narrowed. You don't know what you're digging into. Leave it. She yanked the curtains shut. I stood there, pulse racing, until Linda's golf cart whirred around the corner. I ducked behind a hydrangea, its waxy leaves brushing my face. She slowed near Lot 14, scribbling on a clipboard, then sped off. My gut screamed she'd seen me. Back home, I scrawled notes. Mrs. C digging midnight, pond splash, refused to talk. Was that a deviation? The folder didn't define it, just report by Friday. I logged into the resident portal. Tier 2 progress 03 now blinked on the screen. 3 what tasks, violations. The pond records tab mocked me, still locked. I typed bound again, then chain, denied. Settle from Linda's settle things comment, denied. Each failure tightened the knot in my chest. That evening the hum kicked up, a low roar rattling my teeth. I grabbed my flashlight and followed it, drawn back to the pond. The slab glistened under moonlight, bound stark against the concrete. The water was higher, lapping over the edges, and that chain glinted again, rusted thick, vanishing into the muck. I swept the beam wider. Something else caught the light, a metal box half buried near the cattails, its lid stamped with the HOA logo, a stylized willow tree. My hands shook as I pried it open. Inside, a ledger, yellowed pages, handwritten dates stretching back to '93. Names, fines, cryptic notes. J. Harrow, Tier 3, settled 6/12/95. M. Klein, pond duty 8302. Dozens of entries, some crossed out in red ink. My name wasn't there, yet. A twig snapped. I spun, dropping the ledger into the mud. Greg stood 10 feet away, khakis pristine despite the damp ground, his smirk gone. "Curiosity's a Tier 2 perk," he said, voice low. "But that's ours." He stepped closer and I bolted, clutching the flashlight, leaving the ledger behind. His laugh chased me through the dark. Thursday morning, a new note slid under my door. Tier 2 violation, tampering with HOA property. $200. Report lot 14 by noon tomorrow or escalate. Escalate to what? Tier 3. I paid the fine, pushing my progress to 1-3. The portal updated. Pond access granted. Granted, I hadn't asked for it. At 2 p.m., Rick showed up unannounced, toolbox in hand. "HOA says your back door's loose," he grunted, brushing past me. "It wasn't loose yesterday." He tightened a hinge, then paused, eyeing me. "You saw the chain, didn't you?" I froze. "How'd you?" "Tier 2, he cut in. "They let you see it, next they make you use it." He wouldn't elaborate, just handed me another $20 slip and left. Use it. My mind raced, the ledger, the chain, settled. Was this a threat, a ritual? I watched lot 14 all afternoon. Mrs. Carter emerged at dusk, watering her azaleas with jerky movements, glancing my way every few seconds. At 9 p.m. she slipped out back, a shovel over her shoulder. I tailed her, keeping low behind fences. She stopped at the pond, kneeling by the slab. The hum surged, deafening now. She dug into the mud, unearthing a small metal box, identical to the one I'd found. She opened it, pulled out a folded paper and slipped something inside, a key maybe, before reburying it. A splash erupted, bigger than before, and she flinched, scurrying home. I crept closer. The chain shifted, links clanking underwater. I didn't touch the box. Greg's warning rang too loud. Friday dawned gray and oppressive. I typed my report. Lot 14, digging at pond, midnight, buried box with key. Hesitated, then added, chain moved. I submitted it via the portal at 11:58. A reply pinged instantly. Tier 2 progress 2-3. Attend settlement tonight 10 p.m. Pond. Settlement. That word again. My throat went dry. At 9:45 I walked out, the air thick with that metallic reek. The cul-de-sac was dead silent, blinds shut. At the pond, Linda, Greg, and the gray-haired woman waited, all in black. A crowd of neighbors, Rick, Mrs. Carter, others, formed a semicircle. Linda held a chain, its end dripping from the water. "Tier 2 duty," she said, eyes gleaming. "Pull it." I stared, horrified. The chain pulsed, alive, leading deep into the pond's black heart. Whatever was down there, I was about to find out. The pond shimmered under a gibbous moon, its surface a mirror for the black-clad figures encircling it. Linda's command, "Pull it," echoed in my skull as I gripped the chain, its rusted links biting into my palms. The hum was a roar now, vibrating up my arms, syncing with my hammering pulse. Greg flanked me, his tan face ghostly in the dark, while the gray-haired woman, introduced as Marjorie, the treasurer, clutched her bead necklace like a rosary. Mrs. Carter stood rigid, eyes downcast, and Rick lingered at the edge, toolbox swapped for a shovel. The air reeked of metal and rot, thick enough to choke on. I hesitated, the chain taut, its other end swallowed by the pond's depths. "What's down there?" I rasped, voice cracking. Linda's smile was a razor. "Our covenant, pull or you're Tier 3 by dawn." The crowd shifted, some eager, some terrified. I yanked, muscles straining. The chain resisted, then gave, dragging something heavy through the muck. Water churned, bubbles bursting with a sickly pop. A shape breached, a metal cage, barnacle-crusted, big enough for a person. Inside, a skeleton human, its skull grinning through algae-slick bars. I stumbled back, bile rising. "What the hell is this?" Greg grabbed my arm, steadying me or pinning me. "The first settler," he said, reverent, "bound in '93 to seal the deal." Marjorie stepped forward, her voice quavering. "The developer defaulted. We needed leverage. He volunteered for the good of Willow Creek." Volunteered. The cage's lock was rusted shut, a padlock the size of my fist. No key. Mrs. Carter whimpered, clutching her shovel. Linda raised a hand, silencing the murmurs. "Every Tier 2 pulls. Every tier 3 settles, keeps us whole. She tossed me a key, small, bronze like the one Mrs. Carter buried. Your turn to lock it back. I stared, the skeleton's empty sockets boring into me. This was the heart they pledged to protect, a corpse anchoring their precious HOA. The chain, the fines, the rules, it was all a leash tethering us to this grotesque relic. Why? I croaked. Linda's eyes glinted. Order demands sacrifice. He gave us stability, property values, peace. We maintain it. Rick snorted, breaking his silence. Bullshit, it's control. They fine us, scare us till we're too broke or broken to leave. Marjorie flinched, but Linda didn't blink. Pull or pay, Daniel, your choice. I looked at the key, then the cage. The ledger flashed in my mind, names crossed out, settled. Tier 3 wasn't review. It was this, locked in, drowned, a new sacrifice when the old one wasn't enough. Mrs. Carter's digging, Rick's warnings, the chain's pulse. It clicked. They'd been grooming me, fast-tracking me into their cycle, but I wasn't drowning for their lawns. I hurled the key into the pond. It sank with a plop, ripples spreading. Linda lunged, shrieking, "You idiot!" Greg tackled me, pinning me to the mud. The crowd erupted, some cheering, some screaming. Mrs. Carter swung her shovel, cracking Greg's shoulder. He howled, releasing me. Rick charged Marjorie, wresting her beads away as she clawed at him. Chaos swallowed the night. I scrambled up, slipping on wet grass, and bolted for the slab. Bound, it read, mocking us all. The hum peaked, deafening as the cage sank back, chain slackening. Linda waded in, clawing at the water, her blazer soaking. "We need it," she yelled, voice unhinged. I didn't wait, ran for my house, feet pounding pavement, the metallic tang fatting behind me. Inside, I barricaded the door with a chair, panting. The resident portal glowed on my laptop. Tier 3 initiated. Screw that. I grabbed my phone, dialed 911. "There's a body in Willow Creek Pond," I blurted when the operator picked up. "Human remains, caged, HOA's covering it up." She asked questions, addressed names, but I hung up, adrenaline surging. I packed a duffel, clothes, wallet, keys. The hum stopped, silence crashing in. Sirens wailed 20 minutes later, red and blue lights flashing through my blinds. I peeked out. Cops swarmed the pond, Linda in cuffs, yelling about property rights. Greg limped beside her, shoulders slumped. Mrs. Carter stood with Rick, pointing at the water as divers hauled up the cage. The skeleton gleamed under floodlights, bones stark against the night. Neighbors spilled from their houses, robes flapping, drawn by the chaos they'd ignored for years. I slipped out back, duffel slung over my shoulder, and climbed the fence. The dotted trail was dark now, powerless. I hit the main road, thumb out, hitching a ride with a trucker heading north. "Rough night?" he asked, eyeing my mud-streaked jeans. "You have no idea," I muttered, sinking into the seat. Willow Creek shrank in the side mirror, its perfect lawns a lie unraveling behind me. The news hit 2 days later. I caught it on a diner TV in Ohio. Suburban scandal, HOA linked to decades-old murder. The skeleton was James Harrow, a developer missing since '93. Linda confessed he'd been drunk, desperate, agreed to a symbolic binding that turned real when the HOA panicked over debts. They drowned him, built the myth, and enforced it with fines and fear. Greg and Marjorie flipped, spilling decades of coercion. Mrs. Carter and Rick got immunity for testifying. The pond was drained, revealing more boxes, keys, notes, pleas from past Tier 3s who'd never made it out. I sold Lot 17 through a lawyer, dirt cheap, never going back. The divorce felt tame compared to that hell. I settled in a nowhere town, no HOAs, no rules beyond mind your own. Sometimes I dream of the chain, the hum, that skeletal grin, but I wake up free. Willow Creek's covenant broke when the cage surfaced, its shadows dissolved by daylight and truth. They bound themselves to a lie. I walked away unbound.